Welcome to Unleashed, where MMA icon and power wrestling titan Dan the Beast Severn and Eric Carroll deliver a knockout punch of raw, unfiltered talk. Unleashed. Gear up. Gear up. It's beast mode.
Man, I tell you what, dude, it's kind of freaky looking at you. You look just like your dad.
Yeah, everyone's always said that you get that promo look, that eyebrow and your flower. I'm coming down to get you.
So I was reading into your history. From what it said, you were an amateur wrestler. You never had any aspirations or inspiration to get into pro wrestling.
Well, my parents kind of kept me away from it. I mean, of course, I went to see my father wrestle a lot, but they never, like, if anything, they pushed me away from becoming following in his footsteps. My father always said, I'm going to send you to college and use your brain, not your body.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to end up like me and be away from your family 300 days of the year. And it was real hard back then because they wrestled so much as opposed to nowadays. They didn't have the big, huge shows back then. He wrestled Flair 5 nights a week, every night for years. Dude, an hour at a time.
That had to be crazy, man. Like, how often did you see your dad when you was a kid?
Well, that's how I did a lot. I was blessed and got to travel all over the world with him, but that's how I spent my time with him. He was in town, of course, off some of the time, and we did father-son things a lot. But even when he was in town, he was always, and one of the reasons he's so respected in the industry is when he was here in town, supposedly off, he would go to every one-horse town in Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Kansas. If it was within 6-7 hour drive, he'd go there to a town of 400 people, and 399 of them would be at the wrestling match. He'd let their little local hero beat the hell out of him. And then he'd win in the last 2 minutes, but then he'd leave town and their local hero could run around saying, I was this close from beating the world champion. And so he was, that's one of the reasons why they respect him so much in the business, is he was, whatever it took to entertain the fans, wherever they were, he did.
It's awesome, man. I'm curious now, when you was younger, I will never say wrestling's fake, because it's not fake. And I know you saw your dad's injuries, but did you know that wrestling was choreographed back then growing up?
Well, yes and no. I mean, yes, to a certain extent. I mean, they might have had a script going into the ring or into the match, excuse me. But, things started getting off script or whatever. Dad would put him in an arm bar or some sort of submission hold, and he'd whisper in their ear, he's like, don't piss me off. Because they knew that if it did get out of hand, and with the script and who was going to win, who was going to lose, that went out the window, he would beat the hell out of anybody he was in the ring with. So they were scared to death of him. So they listened to him. He's called the ring general. They listened to him.
Now, how tough was your dad, Justin? I mean,
I've heard
stories over the years, but I'm curious. And how was he with you growing up?
When they call him the toughest man on God's green earth, or the various different acronyms they use for tough for my dad, he was that and all of it. The man had unlimited pain tolerance. There's stories. He broke his femur and his leg in a match one time, and this is long time ago, maybe 60s. He broke his femur in a match, and they took him to the hospital and they put a cast on him. Oh, he got out of the hospital, broke the cast off, got in the car and drove 300 miles to the next town and braced it up as best he could and wrestled the next night.
Jeez. Now, what made your dad so tough like that?
He was an old farm boy. I mean, he didn't show pain. He started wrestling in the carnival. And that was against guys that had no experience in wrestling. pay a nickel to beat the guy in the ring. Well, he was the guy in the ring, and these big, huge old hillbillies had come out of there with their bib overalls and 300-pound, farm man strength, and they didn't know how to wrestle though. So it just turned into a big fist fight, big brawl, and he learned a lot from that. He learned how to. He was such a good technical wrestler, but he knew how to brawl too, and that's where he got that from. I mean, I've even heard stories for bets when he was in the circus, he'd take a nail, not a big one, but a nail, and he'd push it in one side of his bicep and like from the inside, pull it out the other side.
That is crazy, man.
Yeah.
Did you ever get to see him in a real fight?
A lot of times in the ring, it was a real fight. But no, I did see him. One time comes to mind. There was a wrestler here in Kansas City called Rufus R. Jones, and Rufus R. Freight Train Jones, and he opened up a bar and restaurant near downtown. We're out in the suburbs now, but near downtown. Dad and I were having dinner in there one night with another couple guys, and two gentlemen walked in the door. One stood by the door to keep people from leaving or coming in. The other one went table to table robbing people. They got to Dad's table or our table, and from a sitting position, Dad just went up and clocked him right in the chin, so hard that both the jawbones latched from the side of the guy's head, and from a sitting position. And the guy went down. Dad scooped him up and walked toward the door where the other guy was there, and the guy wasn't going to shoot his friend, so he threw one guy into the other guy. They both rolled out the front door. He grabbed the sack of stuff that they'd stolen from everybody, set it on the bar, said, "Folks, come get your stuff." And he went, sat down, and finished his meal.
That is crazy, man. I've heard so many different stories about Harley. One of the ones that I've heard that was my favorite was David Manning talking about them going to a bar, and Harley said, "We're going to take on all of you," and made him pour his drink out on the pool table. I'm sure, all these years, which we just lost Harley, about 5 years ago now?
Yeah, August 1st, 2019.
Yeah, so I'm sure you heard a lot of stories from your dad, but getting to get around all these other wrestlers, what's one of the best stories that you've heard somebody else tell you about your father?
That someone else told me. Well, some of the things I found out, I mean, like the thing about him going to when WWE or F, I guess it was, first came to Kansas City before they had taken over everything and Dad was still NWA. I'd heard, but never really validated the story about him showing up at the matches with a gun looking for Hogan.
Right.
And I mean, I'd heard that, but I've heard it enough now over the years that, I guess it was true. I never saw it. In other words, I wasn't there, but enough people have told me, and with enough similar accuracy, that must have been true. And he couldn't find Hogan, so he set the ring on fire.
Well, I listened to Hogan tell the story. Now, Hogan says he was sitting on the toilet and Harley came in the bathroom. He didn't even get to wipe. He said he stood up like, "What's going on?" And Harley got him and was about to, really light into him. Then he sat there and thought about it for a second and was like, "You think you can get me a job?" So that was Hogan's recollection of that event.
Yeah.
So it obviously happened. The details in between, I'm sure over the years, by the time it gets told from one person to the next. Did your dad ever talk to you about that story?
No, he talked more about the confrontation he had with Vince when Vince tried to pay him to not go to Starrcade and jump over the WWF, and Dad said, "No, I'm a man of my word. I'm going to Starrcade," because he was to wrestle Flair there.
That was my first time hearing about that. So at one point in time, Vince was trying to offer your dad $250,000 to no show at Starrcade. Could you tell us about that?
Well, my father's the man of his word, and if he was going to Starrcade to crown the new king, or crown the new champion, I should say, in Ric Flair, and if he wouldn't have shown up, that would have totally messed up the whole situation and Starrcade and everything else. And he was a man of his word. He said he was going to Starrcade. He went to Starrcade. It wasn't any amount of money. Some men can't be bought.
Right. I think that speaks very highly of Harley too, because $250,000 in 1983 was a lot of money. Still is.
Heck yeah, it was.
Definitely, back then. What was your dad's outlook on Vince?
Well, I'll tell you a story. Vince Sr. was a wonderful guy. My dad got along really well with Vince Sr. Jr., Vince McMahon Jr., he was just an ambitious, shrewd businessman.
Yeah.
And I don't know that Dad had much of a problem with him. He didn't like what Vince had done with wrestling, but he was also smart enough to realize that things evolve. Personally, I have never had a man. He's only been kind to me. In fact, the story I was going to tell, I was in the locker room with Dad in Poughkeepsie, New York, with the night they crowned him the king of wrestling. And I found, it's a little foggy, but I found $240 sitting in the dressing room. I went to my dad and Dad, I just found this. And he said, well, it's not yours. So he went to Vince and said, Vince, my son just found this. And Vince is like, well, that's very, that's very, shows a lot of integrity to your son that he didn't just put in his pocket. He told you about it. Now you're telling me about it. And he said, just let him keep it. And Dad said, well, it's not his. So Vince said, watch this, Harley. He looked back at the dressing room. He said, anybody lose $240? Of course, everyone's hand went up. And Bobby Heenan said, is it green? And so obviously Vince wasn't going to give it to anybody. So he took it from my dad. He said, all right, Harley, it's mine. I lost it. And then he looked and gave it to me. And he said, and now it's yours. So he ended up giving it back to me anyway.
Oh, that's
so, I have little memories like that of Vince. So I've never had anything personally. The guy's always been nice to me.
That had to be a fun time for you back in the day, being in the back room with all these wrestlers. Was you a fan of pro wrestling?
Well, I really can't say that because I didn't know any different. I mean, my dad didn't become a wrestler when I was a teenager or something. Yeah. I grew up. There's photos, I don't know, maybe you've seen them floating around the internet of me in this little striped kind of a like tiger print. It was called my wrestling tights. And I carried around my wrestling bag and I had my little wrestling boots and I'd wrestle with my stuffed animals and my mom would hold up my hand, declare me the winner. And so I didn't know any different. So I can't say that I was a wrestling fan. I loved the guys. I loved sitting around and listening to the stories of the guys, back in the dressing room. I didn't, except if my mom and I were there, we'd watch a match occasionally. But if I was by myself with my dad, I never went out and watched the matches. I just hung out with the guys because they were so funny.
Well, obviously, I could, and I'm going to be asking you much more questions about your dad, but you being privy to a lot of that information and those stories, not just about your dad. What's one of the craziest wrestling stories that you've heard?
Let me think. You mean ring stories, wrestling ring stories, or just about the guys?
Yeah, about the guys in the business, whatever.
Well, I don't know about crazy. It was crazy to me because I was a kid, but there's a lot of stories. In fact, I'm writing a book, and the book is entitled "Don't Tell Your Mother," and it insinuates exactly what it means. Things that Dad and I did that don't tell your mother. And in 1970s, Dad had a Jeep Wagoneer. Back then, it was in the glove box. It had a little switch. You'd switch it to emergency, and all four of the tires would pull at one time. It was like a tank. Flair loved it, so Flair bought it for my dad. My dad bought a new one. Well, we were in Carolina somewhere, and after the matches, and Flair pulled up to the stoplight, and Dad pulled up behind him. And I wonder how powerful this thing is. So he went up and touched bumpers and pushed Flair right through the stop sign, right through the stoplight. The smoke and tires squealing everywhere. And sure enough, an officer saw it, and the officer came up and stopped him. And he jumped out with his gun out, thought he was going to be arresting people. And he saw Flair, then he saw my dad, and it turned into all law enforcement was forgotten about. the guy's radioing his buddies, other officers, to come over and get autographs and this and that. And I mean, for something that was, you don't do that type of stuff. And as we've gotten back in the car and we were leaving, he looked at me and said, "Don't tell your mother."
I've heard a lot of stories about your dad driving. What kind of driver was he?
Fast at all times.
Yeah.
Whereas in 1977, he bought my mom a 911 Porsche. So we get this car and had it for a couple days. And there's this road in South Kansas City. It used to be dirt roads and just this highway running through it. Now it's all, of course, built up. But he called it the Autobahn because there really weren't enough police to patrol out that far, except for the highway patrol. And this wasn't really a major highway. So we jumped on that thing in this car and off we went. And at that speed, when you see an officer, what are you going to do? So he went blowing past the officer. And I don't know if you remember the movie Smokey and the Bandit. Yep. But when they pull the nose to nose, police, the cop cars, nose to nose, and the guys with their guns, over the hood and over the trunk of the car and whatnot. So they set up this roadblock, and of course we had to stop at that. And the officers came up kind of in a semicircle. All of them had their hands right on their hips, ready to pull the guns. And one kind of came out forward or broke out from him. He walked up, he looked down on the driver's side window, and he just shook his head. He said, "Harley," or actually he called him Mr. Race. He said, "Mr. Race, do you have any idea how fast you were going?" And my dad said, "Well, the speedometer was pegged at 150. And the police officer said, "Sir, you were doing 163 miles an hour. You were tripling the speed limit." And at that time, all speed limits were 55. There wasn't, during the oil embargo, whatever, there wasn't 65, 75 speed limit. It was all 55. You were tripling the speed limit, sir." And Dad said, "Yeah, well, I saw you. I was letting off." It's like, being honest. And the officer said, then Dad said, "It's a new car. I'm breaking it in." The officer said, "Sir, now that it's broken, the speed limit is 55 or around there." And he said, "Okay, all right, sir. And would you mind signing some autographs for some of the other officers?" He said no. So we went up and signed some autographs and got back in the car, and we took off going back the other direction at around 55. And he looked at me and said, "Don't tell your mother." And I never did. She finds out stories even nowadays with me writing this book that you guys did what? And awesome. I'm 53 years old now.
Yeah. When is the book coming out?
Later on this year. I'm trying to get it toward the middle of the year. It's hard work writing a book. It's a lot more work than you think.
I'm in the process of finishing my first one, and I thought I was going to be able to do it in a couple months. And a couple of years later, we're finally about to read it.
I hear you. Well, I mean, I've got all these stories, like I'm telling you, and you make those stories into chapters. It's a little bit of an effort because you got, you add some verbs and description of the time and the weather, to stretch the story out to make it even funnier.
Yeah.
And then, nailing a punchline or nailing a "don't tell your mother" on paper is a lot more difficult than me telling you "don't tell your mother." You get the Harley voice and the whole thing going. So it's been a challenge, but I'm hoping to get it out this middle of this year.
That's awesome, man. When did you find out about the dark side of the ring and Vice wanting to make this episode on your dad?
They approached us about a year ago, actually. It's been. Pardon me.
Oh, you're fine.
They approached us about a year ago. A guy flew down from Toronto. The Vice is located in Toronto, New York City. He flew down from Toronto. Well, he called us first and asked us if we'd be willing to talk to him. So we met with him and started telling him stories about Dad, and he got more and more intrigued and laughed. And finally, we got to the end. He's like, "This is going to be the greatest story we've ever done." And so that's how it started about a year ago. And it's been a couple months after that. They wanted family photos and whatever. And my mom was always kept everything. Always, every photo that was taken, we kept. rather organized too. And her and I went through 7, 8 big boxes full, I mean, thousands of pictures, and pulled the ones that we thought they might be interested in. And we sent those. We sent some old Super 8 reel of him and my mom back in the 60s and 70s, long before video. And it was a lot of work. And we finished that part of it up in about September. And they told us it'd probably come out in around January, but it's taken until now to put it together. But they did a great job.
They did, man. They've done a good job on so many of the others. This past weekend, I got to go to Dallas and see and talk with Kevin Von Erich. He said it was one of the more enjoyable experiences that they got to do. I'm curious, like you're talking about world class. What was one of your dad's favorite territories?
Well, in the United States, of course, he loved the Central States. This is his home. Yeah. But as far as globally, he loved going to Japan, and the Japanese loved him.
How often did he go over there?
Oh, he went over there 60 sometimes.
Oh, wow.
He was when he won the 7th world, the NWA 7th time when he beat Lou Thez, the record. The Japanese were they totally loved him. He started going there in the 70s when, it wasn't that far after World War II. So he was one of the first, bleached, blonde-haired American, big, huge American go over there. And so when he won the 7th title, there's a photo of me and hugging my dad as he's going back to the dressing room. You can tell I'm crying. And that photo ended up being on the front page of the Tokyo newspaper.
Oh, man.
Now, the Tokyo, the front page, not the front of the sports page. And that's circulation of about 22 million people. And in Japanese lore, when a samurai warrior went through 7 battles and survived, he was proclaimed a god. So with this picture on the front page of the Tokyo newspaper, it said, Harley Race, 7-time world heavyweight champion, not human, but God.
Mm.
And that's how we were treated when we went to Japan. I mean, just always with, everyone, people follow us around like a herd would be following us around everywhere we went. And the kids would come up and grab my hair and pull one out and look at it because it was blonde and they'd never seen blonde before.
I've heard that. I've heard that about people going over there. That's crazy, and to think of just how much hard work your dad put in. One of the questions at that event somebody asked Kevin was why he never wanted to be an NWA World Champion. He said, look, I was a family man. He said, literally, the NWA World Champion, they expect you to wrestle an hour a night. And it was like, you're everywhere. It was like, I just didn't want that type of schedule. I didn't realize just how much those guys had to wrestle if you was the NWA World Champion. What was like, give us maybe a little example. I know there was one in Dark Side of the Ring. What was an example of the travel schedule for your father?
Well, the one that he alluded to, I think he alluded to a different time. He might have forgot the one I'm talking about when they asked him that question years and years ago. But one, I believe it was December 17th in whatever year. He wrestled for 1 hour in Tokyo, Japan. The December 17th, the same day in LA, you cross the international date line, so you're back a day. December 17th, in Los Angeles, he wrestled for 1 hour. And the next day on December 18th, he wrestled in San Juan, Puerto Rico for an hour. So 3 hours in basically 2 days.
It's crazy.
And then came right from San Juan right back to Kansas City and chartered a flight to Western Kansas where I was wrestling in the state championship or something. I was wrestling in something so he could see me.
Now, did your dad help you in your amateur wrestling career?
Yeah.
Yeah. Was he a good amateur?
His help was if the referee's over here, then they don't know what you're doing over here. So he'd teach me about pressure points and things like that and how you can, leverage people's ankles and wrists and whatever, how you can leverage them and it not really look like it's hurting or not really look like you're doing anything wrong, but it is hurting the hell out of them. So, he taught me some great moves. He was a great technical wrestler. So he taught me a lot of throws, Greco-Roman style wrestling. And then, of course, he taught me the little secrets.
There you go, man. Like seeing all the stories, your dad went through a lot of stuff. Did he ever talk to you much about his first wife that died in the car wreck with him?
No, he not real. I mean, of course, I know what happened,
Yeah,
and what happened is pretty much how it's been told. Uh, Vice did a good job on that. He was declared at the scene, dead at the scene. Um, so it happened so long before I was born that it wasn't like something that had been, brought up. It wasn't like something he was still thinking about or still mourning over or whatever.
right.
But you can't not forget something like that. I'm sure he thought about it a lot more than he mentioned it.
Was your dad, though? I mean, he doesn't strike me as the type of guy that would go around talking about the things that bother him. I mean,
Talking about the what?
like things that bother him? Was he like really expressive of his
Oh,
feelings, or just like my dad? My dad didn't tell us he loved us or any of that. We knew he did, but it was
yeah.
just you weren't going to get nothing like that from my father.
Well, interestingly enough, he told me he loved me a lot. I mean, actually, he was more emotional and sentimental than you'd think. The thing about him, he was just quiet. He never said anything. But when he did say something, everyone in the room quieted down because they knew it was either going to be hilarious or full of wisdom.
Mm.
So he was introverted in that respect, but his emotions, I mean, I can remember, I remember him when his father died, when my grandpa died. I remember he walked out, we were in Colorado skiing, and he walked out of the hotel room, been gone for a bit. So I walked out and I started looking for him, and I found him standing outside the hotel, smoking a cigarette, sitting against the wall, backed up against the wall, and I could tell he was crying. That was the only time I've ever seen him cry.
Mm.
So he was pretty open with my mother and with me about his feelings, toward us. But to the outside world, you think most people would think that does he ever talk?
Yeah.
But if he did, boy, it was like you remember those old investment commercials about that business E.F. Hutton, and they'd say when E.F. Hutton talks, people listen.
Yeah.
That's what he was. The whole dressing room, they'd be Junkyard Dog and Flair and all those guys raising hell in the dressing room. And you could always tell he had this kind of look when he was going to say something, because he'd look up and he'd think for a moment. His head would go back and forth. And that meant Harley was about to speak. So everyone shut up. And then he'd say what he had to say, and they'd laugh or they'd learn something and they'd go back to what they were doing. That's all he said.
Gotcha, man. What was that like for you, Justin, when your parents split up? I know or let me ask you this. How old was you when that happened?
When they split up, I was in high school. They didn't actually get divorced until I was in college.
Okay.
So, I mean, it was one of those things that the older you got, the more you thought, well, this is probably going to happen, because they argued a lot.
Did they?
It's a tough life.
Yeah.
Being married to someone that's gone that much. Back in that era with the, they all drank so much, and there was girls running everywhere all the time. And, it was a difficult time for a marriage. And I think my dad and her have the record for the longest marriage of a world champion wrestler ever. They were together for nearly 25 years. In fact, when the divorce started to become kind of imminent, was when he slowed down and stopped wrestling. He was at home a lot more and they didn't get along. It was tough. I mean, divorce is never easy on any child, but being an only child made it even the more tougher. And one time you're talking to a lawyer about the good about your dad, bad about your mom. The next time you're talking bad about your dad and good about your mom. And, so it was pretty rough. It was a very expensive divorce that lasted a long time and was very nasty.
That's really got to suck as a kid to have to talk to an attorney about both of your parents.
Yeah, good and bad. Yeah. It was like, so what are we talking? Is he the good guy or the bad guy? Is she the good girl or the bad girl? It's like, what am I supposed to do today? So it was difficult. Luckily enough, when a lot of that was kind of coming to a head, I went to school in Dallas, Texas. So I was 700 miles away from it.
Did you ever go and watch the wrestling while you were down in Dallas, Texas?
Oh yeah, whenever they were in town, I'd take some of my fraternity brothers and we'd go.
That's awesome, man.
They'd sit out there and they'd get the tickets or whatever. We wouldn't pay for any of them to go in, but we'd all go in and they'd start looking around. Where we're going to sit? Where's our seats? Where's our seats? I'm like, well, you guys want to sit out here? You want to go back in the dressing room? We can go back there? Well, yeah. So they ended up not watching the wrestling either. They sat back and just big old eyes the whole time watching these guys play around. Wrestlemania 3, I remember I took a couple of friends there, and Junkyard Dog, Dad wrestled Junkyard Dog that night. WrestleMania 3 was the largest indoor audience for a sporting event ever. There was 104,000 people in the Pontiac Silverdome.
What was it like to experience that many people at an event?
Oh yeah, it was just you had to be there. You know, I mean, it was indescribable to see that many people. I mean, you see 80,000 at a football game, yeah, but then when you got a wrestling match, you've got 20,000 seats on the floor or on the field, so to speak.
Yeah,
yeah, it's amazing. Anyway, JYD, he was deathly afraid of snakes. Deathly afraid of snakes. And of course, at WrestleMania 3, Jake the Snake Roberts was there, and his quote unquote partner was Alice Cooper. So between the two of them, they had a room that had snakes crawling around everywhere. And Dad went and grabbed one of the snakes, and he put it up over his shoulder, and he went up behind Junkyard Dog, and the snake's head was, I mean, the size of a grapefruit. And JYD's sitting there by his dressing room, butt naked, and Dad taps him on the shoulder with the head of that snake, and he turned around. I never seen a 300-pound naked black man run so fast and scream so much like a girl in my life. Just running, oh, damn, Harley, you went, and he running through. Dad's running along behind him, chasing him with the snake. But that's just how that's how those dressing rooms were. They were just their antics. They call it ribbing. They rib each other all the time.
Well, I was going to ask you, I mean, was Harley somebody that often had ribs played on him, or did they leave him alone?
No, he was the ribber, not the ribby. They didn't, no one wanted to, like I said, I mean, when it came down to it, if he, regardless of what the promoter said or what was supposed to happen in the match, if he wanted something to happen, it was going to happen. And the guys were scared to death of him for that, because he was such a tough guy and just so good at what he did and so good at ad-libbing, so to speak, in the ring. And so he ribbed a lot of guys, but they didn't rib him too much. Now they'd think they were, but he'd end up turning the tables on them. There was a time the Canadian Strongman, the guy that won the Canadian Strongman competition, came to he wanted to break into wrestling. So he was in the gym and back in the dressing room, and I guess evidently how he won the contest was he gripped like what would it look like, paint cans maybe full of lead by the tips of his fingers and walked for 50 yards or whatever. That's how he won the competition. And, so amazing strength in his hand. Well, the guys knew about my dad's strength too in his hands. So they, ribbed this guy. Go try Harley. Go play Mercy with Harley. And they didn't know at the time what was going to happen, really, because this guy was enormous. So he went over and he pokes my dad very disrespectfully. And I hear you got a pretty good grip. Dad said, oh, it's fair, I guess. So the guy put up his hand. Dad had his cigarette in the left hand. He put up his right hand because he was left-handed. So he put up his right hand, never stopped smoking his cigarette, never got out of his chair, and broke every finger and bone on the guy's hand.
Whoa.
And he had a guy dancing up on his toes like a little girl. And the whole locker room just erupted in laughter. And the guy, he let go, and the guy just kind of went off with his hand like this. And needless to say, didn't wrestle that night.
Did you ever try to test your father?
Oh yeah. I mean, no, I never, put it this way, I never tested him thinking I might win. No. But as I got older and he got older, I'm like, well, heck, he's 70 now. I got to be able to at least, maybe be equal or something. He'd still just crunch my hands right underneath. He and Danny Hodge, Danny Hodge was a famous collegiate wrestler. He and Danny Hodge were the only two human beings I've ever met that could take a stainless steel pair of pliers and bend the handles together.
Oh, so Harley could do that too. I've heard about that with Danny.
Yeah. Those were the only two guys I've ever known that could do that.
Wow, man. I know you got your book coming out, but I'm just so interested. So I wanted to ask you about this. What is a few of your favorite ribs that your dad played on some of the wrestlers?
Well, let me think. He used to have this Colt 44 Magnum with the revolver, and it had a 12-inch barrel on it. And the guys were always wanted to shoot it. So when someone didn't know what had happened to other guys, he'd load it with a regular, a Magnum, a regular, and a Magnum. So he'd go up and he'd say, "Oh, I'm going to shoot it first." And he'd have a regular in there, and he'd just hold his gun loose, whatever, and boom. So he'd hand the gun to the guy, and then that wrestler, whatever, with him. Guy'd hold it real loose, boom, and back that gun kick tore the hide right off the guy's hand. And Dad took it from him. He's like, "Here, I'm like this." Getting it back to a regular. Just hold it like this. And he holds it loose and he shoots it. Guy, "Well, I'll try it again." Boom. That gun kicked back and tore all the skin off his hand even more. They never figured out what he had done.
Oh, that's funny, man.
Let's see some of the other things. He did so many goofy things to some of the guys. Well, he actually, when tasers first became like kind of taking over as far as pepper spray and mace and whatever, the whatever you call them, the tasers, the 10,000 volts or whatnot. He got himself one of those. Every time someone pissed him off in the dressing room, he'd go over and hit him with that taser.
Those things hurt, man.
Oh, yeah. He didn't care. Like I said, when he was in the ring, if things weren't going the way they were supposed to go, he'd put them in a arm bar or something where he'd get down close to their ear and, "Don't piss me off."
What age were you when you stopped hearing "Don't Tell Your Mother"?
When I stopped hearing it?
And when you stopped hearing him say that?
Oh, yeah. The day he passed away.
I figured so.
Yeah.
What was those last few years like with Harley?
It was hard. I mean, he got back to his pain tolerance thing. He fell and broke both of his legs one time, a couple years before he died. Just fell walking and broke both of his legs. No one was at home. When one of the guys finally went over to the house, they found him lying on the floor, smoking a cigarette and drinking a cup of coffee with two broken legs. He's like, "Well, I can't get up, so I just thought I'd sit here." But his memory was going. He'd get hit in the head with a metal chair 5 nights a week, 300 days a year.
Yeah,
for 40 years nearly that he wrestled. You're going to have memory problems. So yeah, and then I always got the feeling that he had crossed his finish line. He had done everything he ever wanted to do successfully. He'd been the GOAT of his sport. Raised a successful, good son. He was just kind of waiting around, for his time to be up. He ended up getting pneumonia. Well, actually, first he had lung cancer, and then he got pneumonia. And where the pneumonia was located was behind the lung cancer, so they couldn't. He was too weak for him to be treated for the cancer, but they couldn't get to the pneumonia either because it was behind it. So there was not much they could do. So over the last year or so with the lung cancer and then pneumonia, that was, you could tell the end was coming.
Your dad was a pretty heavy smoker too, right?
Yeah, that's put it mildly.
Put it mildly.
Yeah, even the guys could never figure out. They could never figure out, Hogan and all those guys and Savage could never figure out why they couldn't pick up Andre, and my dad body slammed him. And they could never figure out how Dad could go through 3 packs of Marlboro Reds a day and wrestle an hour.
What about his drinking, man? From what I hear, Harley's drinking was pretty legendary as well.
Yeah, well, back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I mean, professional athletes drank a lot. It didn't matter the sport. But wrestling was very notorious for it because, of course, you worked at night and you went on to the next town at night, and the next day you slept, got up, and wrestled there. So it was almost a competition, who could drink the most between one town and another. Yeah, he'd have Andre in the car, and Andre could drink ungodly amounts of alcohol. And he'd drink, coming home from St. Louis to Kansas City, Dad drank a case of beer.
Mm. Could he keep up with Andre?
No one could keep up with Andre.
I didn't figure so.
We had parties at our house after the matches. Sometimes Andre just came in town to stay with us because my dad would take him downtown to this big and tall man store, and they'd make clothes for Andre. But so he came in town quite often, but he was in town for a party. We had this really nice basement. Had a dance floor and a bar and pool table room, media room. And the only problem, it was 7-foot ceiling, and Andre was 7'6". So he'd get down into this basement and all hunched over, and there was only 2 chairs in the house that my dad would let him sit in. They were those old solid oak, like three-person wide church pews. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Just solid wood. Those were the only 2 that Andre wouldn't break if he sat in it. So he'd sit down in that chair. Justin, you bring me beer. And that was my job for the night, was to bring Andre beer. So and Andre's hands were so big, he drank tall boys, 16 ounce. Yeah. You couldn't even see the can in his hand. And I'd run back and forth and bring him, and I brought in at least 120 beers.
Wow, man.
I mean, I was keeping track, and after about 100, I was like, all right, whatever. But it must have been 120 or more.
What kind of person was Andre when you got to be around him?
He was great. I mean, in his latter years, he got a little bit mean to the fans and to the public. He was in so much pain. He had a disease. Obviously, he had a disease, but he had other diseases that people didn't know about. One of which was his body stopped growing or his back stopped growing before his body did. So he would have even been taller, but he was in immense pain. But he was Uncle Andre to me. He was always excited to see me, and I would run up and grab a hold of him. He'd sit me down on his knee and bounce me up and down. I'd basically hit the ceiling. And they had this special mattress in one of the guest rooms at our house for Andre. And even with the biggest mattress that they could have made, his feet still hung over the edge by about a foot. And I'd go in the morning, getting ready for school. I was a little boy, and I'd sit there and I'd take a feather or something, and I'd tickle his feet. And I'd stand here, leave me alone. I said, come on, get up, Uncle Andre, have breakfast with me. Yeah, leave me alone. And so, he was great. He was like a jungle gym.
Little inappropriate, but I've heard so many stories. I got to ask you, since you got to spend time with him. Did you ever get to witness a fart from Andre? Because from what I hear, they were legendary.
Not offhand that I can recollect, no. But I'm sure it would have been an earth shaker.
Yeah. How about the iron
just
claw?
Like all human beings' teeth are about the same size.
Yeah.
The guy must have had 100 teeth. So, so if you want to transcend that into your question, you can, everything in Andre was twice the size of normal human. So
yeah,
you can imagine.
Yeah, man. Justin, did you get to see the Iron Claw movie?
Yes, I did. I thought it was very well done.
What do you think?
In fact, Kevin Anton, the guy that played my dad, I conversed with him quite often.
Okay, that was what I was going to ask you. What did you think about? I thought he did an amazing job as your dad.
He did a very, very good job. I was impressed. I really, watching him in the movie, I felt kind of a little bit like I was watching my dad. He did a great job. And that comes from, now people that weren't as familiar with my father, didn't know him or whatever, they probably couldn't tell the difference. But being dad, I can tell all the little tweaks and colloquials and things that my dad does that maybe they weren't portrayed the same way or whatever. But I think he did an outstanding job. No one would know it but me. You know what I mean? The difference.
Right. Absolutely, man.
And I
brother,
think all the guys that played all the Von, I mean, Vera Von Erich, those guys were friends of mine when I was a kid. They were all around my age, or we were all about the same age. So we used to play together and all. And to see them portrayed in a movie, I think that everyone in that movie, I think that movie should have won more accolades and awards than it did, because it was a very good description of a very sad tale.
yeah, it really was, man. Justin, I just wanted to say how much I thank you for doing this. It's great to be able to live through these stories as you're telling it. Let me ask you a question though.
Sure.
With Harley being your dad, everybody remembers him from wrestling. If there was one thing you could let people know about your dad that maybe they don't know about, what's something you would want them to remember your dad for?
He was probably one of the most gentle people anybody would ever meet. He had a thing for animals, like pets and kids. We used to go to Children's Mercy Hospital on Christmas Eve and give presents out to the kids. And if there were kids that he couldn't really talk to because the kids were so bad off or in such pain that it pulled on his heart too strong, and he couldn't do it. It's kind of like those ASPCA commercials where they show the dogs all chained up or whatever. I can't watch those. I got to turn it off.
Yeah.
And that's how he was. He was a lot more sensitive and like I alluded to earlier, a lot more sentimental than people would think. Just because he's quiet didn't mean he didn't feel anything.
Right.
And he was just, my mom even called him Big Teddy Bear. So that's one thing that I would want people to know. Anybody that's ever met him probably knows this, no matter how afraid they were of him when they saw him or when, for the initial meeting. After 30 seconds or a minute, they realized this guy's, the calmest, nicest guy I've ever met.
How about Hulk Hogan? Do you think he thinks that?
Oh, yeah. He had a lot of respect for my dad.
Oh, yeah.
Regardless what happened. We went to, it was in the Meadowlands, I believe. Yeah. In Meadowlands I'm trying to think. Oh, my dad's wrestling bag didn't make it on the flight. And Hogan, that's back during Hulkamania, Hogan had everyone's ear. He just, belted out as loud as he could. All you office boys, go to the airport, find the king's luggage. And off they went. And we kind of waited there. And sure enough, they found it. It had been on the wrong flight. I missed luggages. It was on the wrong flight or whatever. But Hogan directed every one of those guys to go to the airport and find the king's luggage.
Oh, man.
So, and Dad, of course, taught Hogan how to wrestle.
Really? I didn't know that part.
Oh, okay. In Tampa, Florida, back in the 70s, there was this biker bar that Dad frequented, and, Harley Davidson type. And Hogan would come in there and try to pick a fight with him every night. And he'd punch Hogan, knock him out, and throw him out the front door. And after several weeks of this, finally, my dad looked at him and finally, "You're serious, aren't you?" "I want to be a wrestler, brother." And so he said, "Well, be here at this gym at this time of day and we'll start training you." And, of course, they didn't have wrestling schools back then, just like they did when my dad started. They threw you in the ring with a bunch of old guys and they beat the hell out of you until you figured out how to wrestle.
Wow. I've never heard that one before, man. I heard about Matsuda and him.
So they had mutual respect for each other, regardless of what you see on the internet or TV or whatever.
So he would knock Hogan out, and Hogan kept going back.
Yeah, he'd punch Hogan, knock him right out the door. And Hogan kept coming back and coming back. "You're a tenacious shit, aren't you?"
Dude, I've heard that about Hogan, man. That definitely gives me a new level of respect for him, and that was a great story. And
out on the ring and anywhere else, he was as cocky as they came. But back in the dressing room, at least around my dad, he was humble, he was kind, he was nice, always nice to my mom and I. Really nice guy, really great guy.
Do you stay in contact with a lot of the old wrestlers?
To a certain extent. A lot of them are getting older, where, a lot of them have passed on. I mean, Dusty Rhodes and, some of these guys that I knew really well, they've passed on. But I keep in touch with Rick when I can and Terry when I can. Just kind of maybe once a year thing or whatever. We've when you've been a part, when you were either had already told the story or were a part of the story, after 30 years, you start to run out of stuff to talk about.
Well, guys, if you have not watched The Dark Side of the Ring with Justin's father, Harley Race, you need to go check it out. It was really good. You said that book you're looking at around August?
Yeah, hopefully mid to latter this year.
If anybody wanted to reach out to you on social media or wanted to get in contact with you for, an appearance or something like that, where would they go to?
They can go to, as far as my Facebook, I'm Justin Race. And on Instagram or what have you, I have a name, but Justin Race gets me there. My name is Justin Race on there. The screen name, I guess, called is JUSTBOBBS at att.net. So that's just Bob's with 2 B's at att.net. And otherwise, they can look me up on Facebook.
Awesome, man. Well, brother, I appreciate it.
If something comes about where I need to give them a phone number, I'd be happy to.
Absolutely. Just reach out. Justin, thank you so much for coming and doing this. And hopefully we'll see you again later on down the road.
Hey, thank you. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed it.